Comencem, si els hi sembla, aquest seminari. Gràcies a tots vostès per ser aquí. Gràcies als nostres ponents. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for being here. Comencem, doncs, aquest seminari que porta per títol Can United Kingdom answer its English and Scottish questions? En definitiva, el Regne Unit pot donar resposta a les qüestions anglesa i escocesa. Bé, dit d'una manera molt simple i molt barruera, la qüestió és, atès que Escòcia i Gal·les i Irlanda del Nord tenen competències i exerceixen una sèrie de funcions exclusivament des de les seves institucions, com és que aquestes institucions intervenen també en les polítiques que afecten només Anglaterra. Aquesta seria una mica el que se'n diu la qüestió anglesa, la West Lothian question, I think, no? És una qüestió realment interessant des del punt de vista polític i des del punt de vista jurídic o legal. És una qüestió interessant des del punt de vista pràctic i teòric i de molt difícil resolució. Per plantejar aquestes qüestions tenim a dos experts de primera qualitat. El professor Michael Kenny és catedràtic de Ciència Política a la Queen Mary University i és el director del Mile Institute. It's more or less like this, the pronunciation, Mile. El segon ponent és Daniel Gover, ets researcher també d'aquest mateix institut. Coneixen molt bé el tema, estan precisament treballant aquest tema amb un equip de recerca en aquestes institucions. Comencem, doncs, si els hi sembla. The first one, no? Doesn't work? Yeah. So, el primer dels ponents serà el professor Michael Kenny,
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming in. Thank you particularly to Carles and Maria for the invitation. We're delighted to be here. So we're going to talk about the different questions that are now facing the British state, facing the UK, in terms of the position of the Scottish question of where Scotland fits in terms of the territorial constitution, and also where England now fits. How do I? Sorry, does that change? Both of them. Sorry. So, just to begin, first of all, a bit of context and background before we begin to talk about recent events. First of all, here you can see the map of the United Kingdom, which gives you a picture of the different territories and their relative size. But just to emphasize the differences in population in those different parts of the UK, and particularly the imbalance between England, which has 84% of the population and the majority of the wealth and resource in the UK, and Scotland, which has 8%. We'll return to that important point later. So let me begin in a historical vein, just to give you an overview of how the British state has approached territorial management. As you'll be aware, the predominant model in Britain has been the idea of the unitary state. The perspective from the central state has been that Britain ought to be understood as a single entity, but that approach has always been combined with variable arrangements for the different non-English territories. So there have always been different arrangements for managing Ireland, of course, until the secession of Ireland in the 1920s, and Scotland and Wales. Scotland in particular has always had a significant degree of autonomy, particularly in terms of its church, its legal and its education systems. There have always also been territorial offices of state for Scotland, for Wales and Northern Ireland, and it's through those offices that different governing arrangements historically have been developed. And also in Parliament, so not just in the state, but in Parliament itself in Westminster, in London, there have been different committee arrangements set up for managing the business relating to those territories. The state itself has, since the 18th century, promoted an overarching British patriotism, and you may recognise the flag, which is indicated there, the Union Jack. That has been the official patriotic, official state-promoted patriotism, and Britishness, British patriotism, has always had a variable reach in different parts of the UK. In England, since the 18th century, for the most part, it has been accepted that the English feel British. They express their nationhood in relation to the British state and its institutions, and also that the British state itself was understood through the lens of England. So you have a very English and British, a very deep interconnection between those two identities. In fact, many people would argue until recently there was no separation between the two, a point that always caused great offence and anxiety in different parts of the UK. But that broadly is the historical picture. In terms of Scotland and Wales, since the 1970s, with the rise of nationalist forces and nationalist politics, there has been a growing pressure to develop more devolved, to give more devolution in political terms to those two contexts, to those two territories. In Scotland, a key moment in 1979, there was a referendum not on independence but on devolution. Should there be a Scottish Parliament established? And interestingly, a majority voted yes, but the threshold, the number of people required to vote in favour, was not reached. So the Parliament ruled that Scotland would not get a Parliament at that point. This leads to a major mobilisation, a large campaign across different Scottish parties, across civil society, in favour of a Scottish Parliament. And a constitutional convention is formed in Scotland, which draws in and develops the argument in favour of greater Scottish self-rule, not independence but greater autonomy for Scotland. Then in 1997, the Labour government, led by Tony Blair, is elected a landslide majority, and it is committed to giving more autonomy to Scotland and to Wales, very clearly, in order to head off, to defeat or offset the rise of nationalism. But these are historic reforms in the context of the British state. But they also, in a way, continue a very established pattern of making concessions to the territories at the edge of the United Kingdom. You can see these changes in, I think, a longer pattern. Now, Labour thought that by creating these new institutions, it would defeat nationalism, and it would also ensure its own dominance. I mean, it was genuinely believed, very commonly believed, that Labour would dominate in these territories. That has not turned out to be the case. And since 2007, the dramatic rise of the Scottish National Party has led to the national question coming back in a much more dramatic way. So that takes us to the independence referendum, which I'm sure you will be familiar with, which was held in 2014. In the run-up to that referendum, in I think the final 5-6 weeks of the campaign, the opinion polls start to show that those in favour of independence begin to grow and grow, and the imbalance begins to even out, and you have suddenly the polls show that things are very close, neck and neck, about 47, 48 each on each side. And this leads to a very frantic final few weeks of the campaign, in which the UK parties make a promise to Scotland of further devolution. And here we have, you can see the picture. This is a newspaper article. These were the three UK party leaders offering the vow, making the promise that there will be greater devolution, particularly of social security, of welfare, but also new fiscal powers for Scotland, particularly new powers in terms of taxation. Not all taxes, but a number of taxes will pass to the Scottish government. Scotland votes no by, I think, 54 to 45%. So it's close, but not as close as it looked as if it would be. But it is a closer run thing than most people thought it would be. And the British government then begins to deliver on its promise. It establishes a commission, the Smith Commission, which develops concrete proposals. Those become part of a bill, the Scotland Bill, which has now been passed, and which will come onto the statute book and will begin to be implemented very soon, which reflects these new powers. Most recently of all, the negotiations between the UK government and the Scottish government, the SNP government, have finished. They have now completed, eventually, after many, many fraught weeks, lots of argument. They've agreed a fiscal framework, a complicated formula for adjusting levels of spending in Scotland in relation to the rest of the UK. That has been an unbelievably difficult negotiation. It has now concluded, and that agreement will be introduced once the new powers pass to Scotland. But things have changed again. At the general election of 2015, an earthquake, a political earthquake, happens in Scotland. As you can see the results there in the second bullet point. Out of 56 seats, the SNP win 56 seats out of a possible 58. I mean, just completely remarkable result. I don't think anyone, any betting person, could ever have imagined. I mean, the money you would have made if you gambled on this result. Extraordinary result. Labour, which had dominated Scottish politics, is completely wiped out. Now that continues, that's the culmination of a longer process, but it is an incredibly dramatic result. The Lib Dems, the UK party, have 1 seat, the Conservatives also have 1 seat. Sorry, it's 56 out of 59. And because of the Scottish referendum, but also because of the election result, the way the election goes in Scotland, we now have a new front opening up in territorial politics around England. Now, the English question, some of you may know, is actually a very old question in British politics. And the question really is, if devolution is given to other territories in the UK, what about England? Does England deserve, or ought it to be given, some form of autonomous recognition and new form of representation in the UK system? It's a very old question, but it now is a very much more politically fraught question. It had generally been answered in two ways, the two main options. Some people have long argued that there ought to be devolution for England at the level of England, and some people have argued for decentralisation within England. Some system of regional government has often been favoured. There are problems with both of those models, and indeed what we're going to argue is that it is an existential question for the UK whether it can give England recognition and survive. One of the reasons is that England is 84% of the total population. It dominates the whole of the UK in terms of population, wealth, the economy, and in various other variables. The Labour government tried a model of regional administration backed with assemblies, included popular assemblies. That was put to a referendum in the northeast region and was decisively rejected. The English not interested in regional government. Most people have argued that the answer to the English question is to not pose it. I mean, traditionally, the constitutional orthodoxy in British politics is that this is a question that just shouldn't be asked. Why ask it? The English don't care. They're generally happy. They're the most influential in British politics. What has changed is that in the last 2 years particularly, the English want to ask this question. There are different signs, various bits of evidence to suggest that the English are not happy with the governing arrangements, with the way the union works. They're most unhappy about the way in which funding is distributed across the UK. I mean, this is a very old issue in Britain, isn't it? I mean, this is an issue in all states we're familiar with. The English have long felt that the Scots get too much public spending. That's particularly true in the wealthier parts of England, which is the south, the southeast. And this has grown as an issue, particularly in the context of the recession, the economic crisis. More people feel strongly about this issue. But the final point there is that there's increasingly a question about whether the English are getting a fair deal, whether they are being properly protected in the UK Parliament, which leads to this very technical issue, which we will discuss later, the West Lothian question. However, it's not just about governance. English national identity has been growing, so specifically English identity separate from a British identity. Now, there are different debates. There's a debate about when this began and why. Why is the harder question. It is clearly partly to do with devolution, that the English feel that they have not been given a right that other peoples have been given. But it is more complicated than that. It is rooted in changes in the economy and rooted actually in the European question, which has become the major trigger for English nationalism to grow. Now, there are different ways of measuring the growth of an English identity. Here's one way. It's not very scientific, but I think it's quite revealing. If you see the first picture, this is the 1966 World Cup final, which, as a proud Englishman, is a very important moment to me. This is the last time we had a great football team. And this is, at the final, how do the English celebrate? They celebrate with the Union Jack, the British flag. You can see the odd German flags. We were playing West Germany. It was the final. But it's the Union Jack is the way in which the English celebrate. 30 years on, the Euro tournament held in England, the English turn up with the flag of St. George, of course, a figure we share with you here in Catalonia. And the imagery of the cross of St. George has become absolutely familiar part of English cultural life. And it began in the middle of the 1990s. This is just one example. So a more scientific demonstration of this point. This is polling on national identity preferences. Now this is, some of you will know this terminology, this is a forced choice. If you say to English people, are you English or are you British? So it's somewhat artificial. But if you look at the polling, the orange line is English, I'm primarily English. And that appears to grow, particularly, it grows actually around devolution, around 1999, there's an upsurge. And it grows very recently in the last few years as well. Most people in England still see themselves as British and English. That is the majority choice. But two things have changed. Those people who feel most strongly that they are English rather than British are almost all, or very likely to be Eurosceptic. They will be voting for Brexit. There's a strong correlation. And then the polling picks up in recent years that those people are also unhappy about domestic arrangements, about the way in which the union works as well. There's correlation, not necessarily causation, but it is an important point. And then, since 2014, the question of how the English feel about their identity and about governance becomes a political issue. Now, one reason it does is because the UK parties, both the Conservatives and Labour, are increasingly rooted in different territories. The Conservatives are very strong in the south, the southeast, in the middle part of England, and Labour are very strong in, well, they were strong in Scotland, they're not now, in Wales, and in the big industrial cities of the north of England. The UK still has a first-past-the-post election system which deepens that division. So you get a very concentrated territorial division. And that's a key aspect, a key factor, dynamic driving the politicisation of Englishness. Secondly, the parties reposition after the Scottish referendum. The Conservatives start to present themselves, they can see the advantage of being the party that speaks for England. Whereas the Conservatives have traditionally been the party that spoke for the whole, that saw themselves as unionists, the pro-union party. They begin to shift towards a more overt pro-English stance. Labour is increasingly dependent on its non-English MPs. And we see the emergence too of UKIP, the UK Independence Party, which despite its name is strongest in England and is a nationalist and populist party of the right, which puts pressure on the Conservatives and leads the Conservatives to worry that they are being outflanked in terms of a party speaking up for English interests. And the images at the end, here let me just point to two. Here you see Nicola Sturgeon. These are posters used by the Conservatives in the general election. And Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the Scottish National Party, is presented as controlling the Labour leader, Ed Miliband. He is a puppet. And that is about, it looked during the election as if there could be a coalition government led by Labour with the SNP. So interesting parallel with your recent elections. And that prospect was the main focus of the Conservative campaign. And the argument is Labour will not stand up to the nationalists in Scotland. And so here, on the other side, this is a very clever campaign. Ed Miliband, who was a Labour leader who people didn't quite get or like, your worst nightmare, Ed Miliband as Prime Minister, just gets worse. Here's Alex Salmond, the great Scottish national leader, as in government with him. I mean, these images were very powerful. This was the focus of the Conservative election campaign and, you know, had undoubtedly had an impact on some voters in England. Which leads us to the current position of the way in which the Conservative government proposed to answer the English question. And for that, I will pass over to my colleague, Daniel Gover.
Thank you. Okay, so as Mike mentioned, one of the two big sources of grievance among some in England has been over what's called the West Lothian question. And the reason it's called the West Lothian question, for those not familiar, is because of the man whose picture is up there, Tam Dalyell. He was a Labour MP in Scotland in the 1970s, and he represented the constituency of West Lothian. So essentially the question is named after him. And during the debates over devolution to Scotland that took place in the 1970s, he was an opponent. He didn't want to see devolution take place. And one of his central objections was this question, which essentially was, why should Scottish MPs continue to vote on English matters, such as education and health, once English MPs cannot vote on equivalent Scottish matters? So he was raising this anomaly that would exist post-devolution around voting rights in the UK Parliament. And this anomaly has been exacerbated by further rounds of devolution. So once devolution was introduced from 1999, there have been further rounds of devolution, further powers transferred. And this has meant that this anomaly has grown in significance. And theoretically, it can work its way out in two ways. Firstly, individual votes in the UK Parliament could be carried by non-English MPs, even if it was only England that was affected by the legislation. So individual votes could be carried by MPs whose constituents are not affected by those decisions. But also, secondly, because the UK has a parliamentary system, and because there's no devolution to England, England is effectively governed by the UK government, a government that has the support of a majority of UK-wide MPs. So potentially, it hasn't actually happened yet, but potentially you could have a situation where essentially English government departments like health and education are being run by a UK government that doesn't have a majority of MPs in England. So this is two ways in which this can be significant. Do we have the... Okay. And then what happened following the Scottish referendum in 2014? This picture here, this is David Cameron, the UK Prime Minister, the morning after Scotland had voted. This was very early in the morning, so it's almost really as soon as the results were known, he gave this statement and immediately chose to raise the issue of the English question. And this is significant because it's really the first time that the UK government has really mobilised the English question. As was mentioned before, traditionally the response has been to ignore it. But David Cameron chose to raise it. And so the Conservative government, the current UK Conservative government, is committed to answering the West Lothian question. The question for us now is it possible to do this in a way that doesn't fundamentally damage the UK? And then there's a second part of that, which is, what does this say about the Conservative Party, traditionally the Conservative and Unionist Party, very strongly associated with the Union? Has it ceased now being the party of the Union? And essentially what the Conservative government has introduced is a new system of rules within the UK Parliament, which is called English votes for English laws. And so what it's seeking to do is to give English MPs greater say on matters that only affect England. And these rules were approved in the UK Parliament in October 2015, so October last year, so they're very new. And the key feature of them is that they give English MPs a veto on laws that only affect England. So all UK MPs from Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, England, all continue to vote on all Westminster legislation. So even if the legislation effectively only applies to England, all UK MPs continue to vote. But the vote, they must also have the support of a majority of English MPs in order to pass. So it's an English veto. And it only applies in the lower house, the House of Commons. It doesn't apply in the unelected upper House of Lords. And so the project that we're working on at the moment is essentially to evaluate this new system, English votes for English laws, in terms of how it's operating, how successfully. As I say, it's in its first year, so it's all very new. But I think one really important point to make is that it's been highly politically controversial. So the Conservative Party, the Conservative government, has introduced this change, but all other parties that voted in the House of Commons voted against it. It was an entirely partisan vote to introduce this. Now, for the Conservatives, they hope that this is going to rebalance the UK constitutional settlement to make it fairer. But I think that there are some real questions about whether it risks exacerbating the Scottish question that Mike was speaking about earlier. In particular, there's been this charge made, particularly from the Scottish National Party MPs, that it's creating two classes of MPs. So some MPs who get a veto, some who don't. So there's this claim that it's making the equal status of UK MPs unequal. And there's also a concern that some legislation that appears only to affect England actually might have indirect effects in other parts of the UK, particularly questions around funding, spending levels. So that's the first issue, but the second issue there is whether it's actually likely to settle the English question. These are parliamentary rules. They're very, very complicated. They're very hard to understand, very technical. And essentially, I think it can be said that this is a technical and a procedural response to what is essentially a populist problem. And there's also the fact that, as I said earlier, non-English MPs can still vote and can still be decisive. They can still potentially cause legislation that only affects England not to pass. Plus, there's still not going to be an English legislature or government that's comparable to what exists in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So potentially it risks exacerbating the problems elsewhere and also not satisfying the English question. And then one question that's interesting for us to think about is comparing this to other countries around the world. And the important point here is that asymmetry is not unique. So the idea that you have these sorts of asymmetrical constitutional relationships isn't unique, but there's nowhere where it's as tilted towards one part of the country as in the UK. So in England, 84% of the population. The nearest we can find is in Canada. 35% is the largest component in Canada. And I've put here a quote by Vernon Bogdaner, who some of you may be familiar with. He's a constitutional expert in the UK, who's raised the fact that there is no West Madeira question, no West Sardinian question, no West Catalan question. So really, why is that? And then And then finally, just in terms of where this leaves the UK, I think to summarise, the traditional way of managing the UK statecraft has come under significant pressure. There are these demands for greater autonomy at the periphery, which is exacerbating asymmetry, but also growing calls for rebalancing towards England. And as I said, the Conservative government hopes that this new system of English rates for English laws will help to achieve greater balance within the UK. But it seems unlikely that it's going to satisfy the sorts of pressures that were being spoken about earlier in relation to England. And so the question is really whether asymmetry can ever really be resolved within the UK. It may be, according to some, there's another quote from Vernon Bogtoner, that it's the price that the UK has to pay for keeping Scotland within the UK. But let's just end with what are the possible futures for the UK? And we've set out there three possible options. The first is essentially keeping the union system, but a looser union, accepting greater asymmetry, maybe giving further powers to Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. A second possible direction is towards a more explicitly federal structure, so potentially writing down formalised rules in terms of how the different parts of the UK relate to each other. And then the third possible future is towards breakup. And I mean, it's particularly worth ending here with the forthcoming referendum on the EU, which has the potential to exacerbate some of these different senses of grievance and could potentially trigger or add pressure for a second Scottish referendum. So,
thank you very much for your presentation. Comencem, si els hi sembla, la fase de debat. Mireia, si vols dir una mica de cosa.
Debat o preguntes, Alguna pregunta? Micro.
Thank you. It was very interesting. Let me raise some questions about your new evil system. Not evil, no?
They do call it evil.
So, yeah. It's a question, maybe a kind of critique. If English MPs got a veto power over the legislation apparently only affecting England, why doesn't Scottish MPs got a veto on that legislation only affecting Scotland, for instance? Or why Scottish government doesn't have a veto over the big legislation affecting Scotland? My how can I say it? My broader point is the following. If there is a doctrine of parliament sovereignty in Westminster, that is a kind of the fact that English MPs have less power is a kind of price that you have to pay. Westminster Parliament can change unilaterally the Scotland Act, for instance. So that's not, I don't think it's a big price that you have to let about less than 20% of MPs, I guess, voting on your legislation. That doesn't mean that you can have a kind of convention, I can understand that. But I think it's, thinking about the imbalance of population, it's good to give a kind of de facto power to Scotland, or Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. They can be also scared about this imbalance. They can, next year, they can have a different arrangement in their centralized policies. So that was more or less my question and maybe my critique about this evil system. No, I'm joking. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. I mean, maybe to start with the second part of it, shall I just give the example of the legislation? We have, just to show you here, we were going to put this in, but these are two votes that happened between 2003 and 2005, which were in many ways the prompts for this to become an issue of concern to the English. So this was the higher education bill. This introduced tuition fees, so students paying there was a limit, £3,000, but it was a really big deal to go from a system whereby students didn't pay for their higher education to now they were paying. That was a UK government bill that only applied in England. And you can see the bill was carried. It was a really controversial measure. It was carried because Scottish MPs voted. They were asked to vote for this measure on an issue that did not directly apply in Scotland. And there was an argument that was made that, well, indirectly it had some knock-on effects. I mean, they were very indirect. But I think when that vote happened, there were other examples as well. There was there was something on changes to the English health system. I think when those votes happened, the argument that you gave, which was the traditional argument that the English were broadly happy to accept some imbalances, because for the most part the English got what they wanted. They dominate the Westminster Parliament in terms of numbers, they tend to dominate in terms of ministers, and the parties are very English focused. I mean, that's all of that true, and I think those were the dominant assumptions. I think once these votes started to happen, I think that changed the perception. But the other thing is, and this goes to your first point about the Scottish, where's the Scottish votes for Scottish laws? I mean, of course, because Scotland's got devolution, then the argument is, well, Scotland doesn't need Scottish votes for English laws in the Scottish votes for Scottish laws, because its protection becomes through the measure of devolved competencies. And in most of the key areas, Scotland in particular, because Scotland has the most powers, certainly more than Wales is catching up, it has more than Wales, more than Northern Ireland, that devolution was intended to head off any prospect of legislation passing that would be deemed, that would be felt by the Scots to be an imposition. Now, it is true, you are right, that the Scottish National Party would argue that things are still sometimes passed at Westminster that affect Scotland unfairly, and that's certainly open to debate. That is quite right. But I think it would be true to say, would you say that most of that sense of possible grievance disappeared with devolution, or some of it did, was dealt with by devolution? But I mean, the fundamental point here is this is a UK-wide, a state-wide legislative body is passing laws that, and I'm sure the same is true in Spain, that affects all the different territories in different ways. I mean, that's the way in which the modern states work. And there are such complicated interdependencies. It is very hard to separate these things out. So what Evil offers, it's an experiment, in a way, in whether you can actually assuage a growing sense of English concern with this system whilst not annoying the Scots too much. That's the gamble. And I think it's not clear yet, actually, whether it's seen as illegitimate in Scotland. I think it's still too early to say whether it is seen as something that is unfairly balanced to the English. Would you agree on that?
I could add just one detail to the end of that. I mean, we did try to look at one point just to see, are there examples of legislation that only applies in Scotland that would still be dealt with in the UK Parliament? And actually, it's very difficult to find cases. And I mean, one extra level of complexity, as I said, this system is very complicated. One thing that I didn't mention is that for it to apply, it has to relate exclusively to England, and it has to be devolved to another part of the UK. And because Scotland is generally recognised as having the most advanced form of devolution, it's pretty likely that if it meets that test, then it's devolved in Scotland.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you for your talk. I learned a lot. Just a comment following the Pau's comment. A very specific question. Who decides what's a Scottish matter or an English matter, whatever? Is that a neutral referee, or is somebody in the parliament? Well, I guess there is a figure doing this job. And then a more general question on the populist issue, what you call a populist demand from the Conservatives. I would like to know if that's a populist issue, a kind of backlash against Scottish nationalism, or if they have a kind of long-term program or a territorial model in mind. I think that it's not strange that, given the fact that they get a lot of support in England, they want to deliver to their voters what they voted for, and then they cannot do that because in some votes, I don't know how many votes are affected by this situation in terms of relative terms, so they want to deliver that. So probably what they could have in mind is this federalization of the UK, or maybe a regional, what you call within the England regionalization, meaning cities or municipalities, self-government or something like that. There is no Catalonian question because the other regions in Spain have more or less the same matters devolved, and then there are these basic laws in Spain which are expensive and they are constantly invading other matters which are theoretically devolved, so there is no Catalonian question, but still we have this historical socialist majority in Andalusia, which has been somewhat driving the Spanish territorial model in a sense. So I guess that we could have a case here of conservative majority in England setting the agenda, the territorial agenda of the UK in the future. Thank you.
Do you want to answer the first question? I'll answer the second.
Okay, so in terms of who decides, ultimately the decision is taken by the Speaker of the House of Commons, so that's the presiding officer in the lower chamber.
Who elects is he an elected person?
So the Speaker is a member of Parliament, so they're elected to represent a constituency. And what happens is, once there is a vacancy for the Speaker, members of Parliament vote among themselves on who should be the next Speaker. And so previously they would have represented a political party, but there's a very, very strong tradition that the Speaker, once they are elected as Speaker, is completely politically neutral. And I would say actually there's a very fiercely independent attitude towards being Speaker, towards being completely non-partisan. The Speaker, in making this decision, will get advice from officials in the Parliament and also from legal experts who work for the Parliament. And the government will also present its view as well, which might be helpful in clarifying or highlighting things that they hadn't thought of. But ultimately, it's officials within the House of Commons and ultimately the Speaker taking the final decision.
Sorry, and can be in point in front of the tribunals? Can be the decision of the Speaker can be controlled by the tribunals?
In the courts?
Yeah.
No, again, there's a very strong tradition within the UK Parliament that proceedings within Parliament it is a question that's raised, is whether this does open up the Speaker's decisions to judicial review. So this is a question, and I think the general consensus is no, it doesn't. But you can never completely rule these things out. I think that's basically where where things are, but no, I think is essentially the answer.
I mean, just to add on that, I mean, one of the big worries about this new system, it's a really big fear, is that it will make the speaker a more politicized, that the decisions will be the source of political conflict in Parliament, which is a really big thing because the speaker, you know, has an authority as a sort of neutral figure, which is very important to the way in which Parliament works. So the fear that suddenly you could get conflicts breaking out with people protesting against decisions is a very real one, actually. But the only alternative to the speaker is the government decides. And the government would like that, but nobody else would like that system. On your second question, it's a really good question. It's the key question, I think, in British politics is, what is the Conservatives' territorial project? You know, how do they understand what it is they are doing? And as we said, have they ceased to be a party of the Union and become a party of England? And I think the answer to that, I mean, it's not yet clear, actually. It's still, I think they're working that through. I think they are still a party of the Union, but I think they understand the Union very differently now. And their understanding of it informs their project. And it is basically a very English-centred view. They, for political reasons primarily, the reason that they have been very keen, very happy to give Scotland more autonomy is because they think it's popular with English taxpayers. And it is. The idea that the Scots should have more responsibility, they should raise more of their revenue and be more accountable for their spending. And that relates to the devolution settlement that Labour introduced. There was no accountability for spending. In fact, the incentive for a devolved government was to spend as much as you could. So this is a new kind of model. And it's a model, I would call it an Anglo-British version of the Union. It's very centred on English interests. It is both about introducing this system of protection at the UK Parliament. It's also about introducing devolution within England. So we haven't touched on this, but they are trying to introduce greater decentralisation to some city regions in England. You may have heard Manchester in particular, which is a very ambitious project. But it is, as we discussed last night, it is administrative decentralisation. It is not legislative. So it's still the central state that is controlling the terms of it, but it's a big change. And I think the Conservatives want to rebalance the Union. And the question is whether that will produce a stable settlement in the context of what's happening in Scotland, but also elsewhere in Wales and Northern Ireland. And at the moment, it's not clear. I think we have to wait and see.
Well, I have a question. Sí, perdó. Sí. Ah, sorry.
Thank you very much. My English friends tell me that it's very likely that someone who is, so we say, ethnic English, or in other words, white, is more likely to identify himself as English than British. Whether that's been borne out in surveys, I'd like to know what you think. And one thing I'd like to know, when you said that there's no West Catalonian question, well, it seems to me that there is a Catalonian question, because it seems to me the elections in Catalonia are more and more like the elections in Northern Ireland. In general, throughout the 70s or even the 50s, there might be an English UK-wide general election, and there'd be discussions about health, about defence, about tuition fees, about crime, whatever. But in Northern Ireland, the election was on one thing. It was on the Union. There were the nationalist parties and the unionist parties. And it really didn't matter what the particular politics of the party was towards these individual issues. The key question was the Union. And it seems to me recently, over the last 15 years or so, that has been more and more the question in in Catalonia, that it's more and more, whether it's Ciutadans or the Partido Popular on one side and the Junts per Si put on the other side, and there's some others that kind of effectively fudge the issue, don't quite say yes or no. And so that's just my own personal opinion. I'd like to know what you think. Thank you.
I mean, just on the first question, it's a really important question actually about, so the question is whether those people who are most likely to identify as English are essentially from the ethnic majority, are white in background. And I mean, the answer is yes and no. I mean, it is complicated because it is true that Britishness is generally favoured by ethnic minority citizens. So people who are from different minority backgrounds are, for the most part, more likely to see themselves as British. And the reason for that is that there is a long tradition of seeing, well, in the last, I guess, several decades, is the view that Britishness is a more liberal, overarching, non-ethnic identity has become quite a popular idea. And it's an idea that the Labour Party promoted very actively. And it's one of the reasons why many people on the left are very hostile to Englishness, because the belief is that this is not a liberal identity. It's a conservative tradition, and it's essentially something that's defined in ethnic terms. The evidence, no longer supports that, however. It's complicated and it's changing slowly, but certainly, I mean, my own work has looked into this in some detail, and I think there is quite a lot of evidence that in some minority communities, particularly in younger generations, people are starting to identify as English. And you're beginning to see actually all demographic groups are beginning to move in that direction, but at different speeds, essentially. Now, there is the one outlier, the one exception to this, actually, is people who live in London. So people, if you look at the evidence, those who live outside London are most likely to see themselves as English, or more likely. In London, most people, where many ethnic minority people live, are more likely to identify with Britain. And that is a really key division, because it says something quite profound about the difference between actually everyone outside London, be it in England or in Scotland or Wales, everyone feels increasingly alienated from London. And London is becoming almost like a world on its own. It's a global city, it's a city-state, it has a form of devolution, and it is moving in quite a different direction. So I think it's quite a complicated pattern there. I don't have a lot to say about Northern Ireland, except to say my first job was in Northern Ireland. I lived there, and I completely recognise what you say. I mean, one of the interesting things about the current situation is the way in which, in a place like Northern Ireland, where the question of union is, as you say, the dominant issue, that these other issues about the UK more generally, about Scotland, and also about England are beginning to feed into and destabilise Northern Irish politics. So you're beginning to see a complicated interplay between them. And there is, I mean, certainly around the time of the referendum, the fear in Northern Ireland that actually Scotland might leave, and this might leave Northern Ireland incredibly vulnerable within some sort of reconstituted UK, that has created a new dynamic in Northern Irish politics that is now a really important issue.
For implementing all these scenarios, the federal one or even the devolution, I think you have a lot of work to do. And one of the works maybe is to write a constitution, a truly constitution or not, because it's difficult to run all this without a written constitution, and trying to base all this change in the tradition, no? Or that just without, because it's impossible to establish a tradition by law. No, you need a constitution. No, it's impossible to impose legally a tradition. This is a question that is put in England, actually.
Yeah. Now that is it's a really big question. I mean, you'd all be aware that the British state is extremely reluctant to have a written constitution. You know, the whole culture of the state, the ethos has been about not, and we have a written constitution because we have a body of law. We haven't got a codified constitution.
Super legal.
Exactly. And one of the reasons is, going back to the earlier point, because of parliamentary sovereignty. So the belief is, as soon as you write down, you codify them, you restrict the exercise of parliamentary sovereignty. And the idea of parliamentary sovereignty runs so deep within the British system. But in the last 20 years, parliamentary sovereignty has clearly been abridged, it's clearly been limited in lots of different ways, partly by devolution, but partly by the, joining the EU and the Human Rights Act. That has been the big, and the, for that reason, the law plays much more of a role in British politics. But if you like, the mythology of parliamentary sovereignty runs very deep. And the question, I think, for Britain is whether it can actually abandon that mythology and move to a system that maybe keeps some of the virtues of the British model, because it is a very flexible system. I mean, there are some advantages to not codifying. At times, you can have variable arrangements. You can leave a lot open to interpretation. You can change things quite quickly in response to crises. I think that where we're at now is a question of whether it's more risky to stay in the current model, or it's more risky to suddenly go down a codified path. And there is just entrenched resistance to that. But far more people have, from right and left, have begun to argue for writing down, for codifying the union, because this looks like it could be one way of establishing a new settlement, as you say, and maybe having a clearer statement of what powers are reserved at the UK level, and also what ought to be the common expectations of citizens across the UK. There's quite a push in that way, but the Conservatives won't do it. I mean, it's a really open question whether we will go in that direction.
Bé, una de les raons per què els hem convidat és perquè, a part, diguem-ne, que ens parlessin del tema, estan portant un moment, perquè s'han de posar els cascos. Oh, it should work. Hola? Can you hear? Hola, estem provant la traducció. Funciona? No? Bueno, I tell you later. No, una de les raons és perquè estan portant a terme un projecte de recerca, estan monitoritzant el comitè del Parlament britànic que està pensant tots aquests canvis, etc. Aleshores, el que li preguntaré, I was explaining that one of the things you're doing is this research project. So I would like to know a bit more what you're doing and what you're finding, if it's not a secret. And second, I have a question, a more specific question. In putting this debate into the Spanish context, the first thing it would come is that to put the blame on the electoral system. So has it ever been linked to the electoral system? The proportional system, the failed referendum, was ever linked? Because if you establish a proportional system, I can assure you that the Scottish will disappear from the map. So these two questions. So to explain a bit more about the project.
Do you want to talk about the project, and then I'll talk about
In terms of the project, I mean, essentially, it boils down to where we're analysing the implementation of English votes for English laws in the House of Commons in the first session. So the period between a general election is generally referred to as a parliament, and then within that there are sort of 1 year blocks, which are called sessions. So we're looking at it in the 2015 to 16 session, which ends in probably about a month's time. So we're really looking at did the procedures work effectively? Did they throw up unexpected problems? Some of the big fears around, well, I mean, there are a variety of fears. So there are the fears that I highlighted earlier around creating second-class MPs and things like that. But there are also fears about, does this just add a lot of administrative bureaucracy to the legislative process? Is it going to eat up time that could be better spent debating? Is it going to take a lot of time of officials to work out whether the criteria has been met? So there's the kind of the procedural angle. We're also looking at the sort of the bigger constitutional effect of this. So where is this taking the UK? And then also the sort of the political angle of this. What does this mean for the party system across the UK? Are we seeing the beginning of a much more territorially focused political system? In terms of our findings, I mean, I think we're finding that it's very complicated. I think that the system that the government has put in place is very complicated. And I'm not really sure whether we can say any more than that at the moment, because the session hasn't yet finished.
I mean, yes, so it is ongoing. I mean, the only thing I'd add, I mean, we're about actually to write a report, which is a public report, which will go to government and go to Parliament, and essentially we're going to recommend a different system. Now, we think that that you can produce a system in principle that is less complicated and is more transparent, and probably produce a system which would get more support from other UK-wide parties. I mean, the very basic problem here is it's very difficult to have a stable constitutional change if the only party that accepts it is the party that introduced it. I mean, there's got to be some better process for us. But of course, because we don't have a written constitution, we don't have rules about how you introduce constitutional change. And this is the hangover of sovereignty in the majoritarian system. But I think, so one thing we're going to recommend is that they think about a process that is more structured, is more coherent. We probably will recommend something that I suspect will be probably a bit more modest in the way it works, more consensual. But I mean, and very likely we'll recommend, I think, that the very complicated set of rules that they've got ought to be cut down, and that they ought to really just use this in a much more discretionary way, more occasionally, and just really to avoid the kind of examples here, really, really obvious examples of sort of offence to the English. So it's interesting. I mean, and we in the work we've done, we are talking a lot to different people in different bits of government and to Parliament, and you know what we found is that there is not a very good understanding of the system. It's so complicated to get. Your second question about voting systems is really interesting. I mentioned earlier somewhere that one of the factors that has led to the increasing sort of politicisation of territory is because the two main UK parties are now representing different territories. The reason for that, one of the reasons, is because for UK elections, we do not have proportional voting. We have the first past the post, which means that it really accentuates the dominance of a party. So one of the things about Scotland is that if you'd run the Scottish general election, the last one, but also when Labour were dominant, if you'd run the general election under proportional rules, you'd have had a multi-party outcome. So you wouldn't have had this very divisive position where you have one party in Scotland and then a different party in England. You would have had a much more a much more differentiated set of results. So one argument, which I have myself used to Conservatives who don't believe in proportional representation, is that actually PR might have saved the Union, that their own voting system is probably one of the factors that's caused instability. But on the other hand, your point is a good one. A proportional system, remember that proportional systems are used for the devolved elections, so we have this mixed model. So in Scotland, the elections that are about to happen now are run under a PR proportional system. It has produced a more plural outcome, but not massively so, has it? It hasn't made a huge difference in terms of the outcomes. In the current elections, the SNP will win. They won't win quite as much, but they will dominate. But it is a really interesting question about whether the electoral system, it's sustainable to have at the UK level a different system than that which is used in different parliaments. But I think a second thing is about whether the UK is on the verge of moving beyond the two-party system. I think UKIP, the rise of UKIP is really important because they have, I think, broken the dominance of the two parties. And really, British politics feels like it would more naturally work if we had 3 or 4 parties now.
Alguna pregunta més?
Very, very quick comment. We have a West Lothian question in Spain, a very important one, which is related to fiscal matters or fiscal laws in Basque Country and Navarre, because they have their own fiscal arrangement, but they can also vote for the general fiscal arrangement. So there's a clearly West Lothian question in Spain, and there are a lot of other minor West Lothian questions, but with the fiscal laws, there's clearly...
Does that break through as a salient issue? That's what we're interested in. Why this has become salient in Britain, but we can't see many examples where it becomes a source of tension elsewhere.
As far as I know, but I'm not really looking at the political programs, manifesto. I think it's Ciudadanos basically that is pointing about that, but it's really a new issue, and it's actually people wouldn't know. I think they might be even here surprised to say that, because it's not a political issue, it's not a legal issue, it's not been an issue yet.
No, but we had in the past, in '93, I think, when the Socialist Party was in minority and the Catalan Nationalist Party gave them support, one of the conditions was to change the electoral financing system. Right, so the Basque Country is outside of the negotiations, and Navarra, because they have their own, so they don't take part of the Consejo de Fiscal, blah, blah. But the point was that for the public opinion, the Catalans were imposing their interest in a policy which was Spanish-wide. Yeah. And actually, the agreement they reached, the Andalusian government opted out. So they didn't want to apply the changes in the financing system, especially for the health system, because the territorial and party representation got into conflict. Yeah. So that was a precedent, probably the only one I could remember, but yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. I have heard people say in Canada, I think we were talking earlier, this has occasionally arisen as an issue, but again, how salient it's been, I'm not sure, but that is a very interesting example. And of course, partly it's not likely to be such a big issue elsewhere because you don't have the asymmetry in terms of the size and the population. This is really about whether the English feel that the system they've dominated is suddenly turned against them, is likely to play against. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are other examples there. That's interesting.
I mean, the classic response, I agree on that, but the classic response in Spain to this question has been resymmetrization, meaning copying the status of autonomy of Catalonia. That when Catalonia got more powers, the other regions, in general, they claim for these powers, and that has finally been the Café para Todos, and I think that's the classic response in Spain to this question, instead of, so it was first a complaint about Catalonia having more powers, and later on copying the powers, although in some powers they opted out. But I think that the classic response has been a regionalization of this asymmetry in terms of powers, or homogenization of this. I think that we would say that.
Tanquem?
Thank you very much.
Doncs moltes gràcies, ha sigut molt interessant, gràcies per la presència i gràcies als ponents per la magnífica i tant, no sé, ens ha fet pensar tant. Moltes gràcies.